Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We are diving into lore of old Christmas and winter in the Ozarks, and there's a lot more to cover than you may think. We will get back to that in a minute, but first we want to remind you that the Dark Ozarks podcast is now available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, and about any other podcast platform you use. So what does Old Christmas mean in the Ozarks?
There is a lot to cover that most people do not associate with the holidays, from pyrotechnics and praying cows to burying chicken entrails under the hearth. There are traditions that are often viewed as supernatural or just flat out witchcraft if they were being performed at any other time during the year.
And that's before we get to dark stories of winter, including supernatural beings in the woods.
There are a lot of traditions that are mostly forgotten, that our consumer-driven world would see as dark, and some of these traditions are hard to explain. And of course, in so many cases, it's up to each person to decide what they actually mean in some cases.
We'll discuss Old Christmas and winter lore in a minute. But first, we want to invite everyone to like and follow Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Plus, we encourage you to follow the podcast. We would like to invite you to become a Dark Ozarks subscriber on Facebook. On the Dark Ozarks Facebook page, click subscribe, have your login information ready, and join Dark Ozarks behind the scenes for only $4.99 a month.
Come with us on investigations, deep dive research, and topics that, quite honestly, are too controversial for public view. The next 100 subscribers to Dark Ozarks on Facebook subscriber option will be entered into a drawing for a free Dark Ozarks t-shirt and an exclusive signed first run copy of the new book, Dark Ozarks, The Spooklight. Join today to be entered in that drawing.
Why else should you subscribe to the private Dark Ozarks group? Yes, it does have the subscription fee, but you receive exclusive content and behind the scenes information that's nowhere else. It also helps us bring more original content to Dark Ozarks. We appreciate everyone.
And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts on darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
We encourage everyone to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online on Facebook and their website, alwaysbuyingbooks.com, for all of your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more, not to mention the building's haunted. Tell Bob and Elise that we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and has been twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great food and beer, an historical building with a noir past. And yes, this building is also haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff that we sent you.
Okay. Old Christmas. With some dark twists that most people aren't familiar with, although a lot of people aren't familiar with Old Christmas that much anyway.
Well, that is true. And Old Christmas is January 6th. Old Christmas Eve, consequently, is January 5th. And it all started with Pope Gregory the 13th in 1582.
Yeah, Gregory just decided to churn up the calendar, although, he had a bit of a reason. It was getting further afield of scientific accuracy. So corrections were made, and consequently, Christmas moved.
It did. It did. And so before the Gregorian calendar, Christmas was apparently on January 6th. And after the advent of the Gregorian calendar, Christmas was on December 25th. It has stayed there to this day. So apparently they must have done something correct when they figured things out in 1582. But just because of the way certainly certain nations took their time in responding, and just the way that information traveled back then from 1582 well into the 1600s, a lot of British settlers, essentially British, Irish, Welsh, Scottish, left the British Isles and traveled to America without having gotten the memo that the calendar had changed.
Well, and eventually they just kind of added December 25th on top, and for a very long time, a lot of these immigrants and their descendants celebrated both, actually.
They did. There was New Christmas and Old Christmas. And it is interesting to me because there were different bits of lore associated with the two dates.
Yes. I think Old Christmas retained much more of the older pagan beliefs and customs. And that didn't really change. And so I think it becomes more tied to the season as far as the year goes.
I think so.
Than New Christmas.
And I think it is fair to say that as Christmas became a modern and nationally recognized holiday, interesting note that it was actually not a recognized national holiday for a long time in the course of history, recent American history. But as we moved into the 20th century, the December 25th New Christmas date got all of the attention by the larger narrative, and the Old Christmas, January 5th, 6th, really didn't receive any attention. And I think it's a great example as how, to such a large degree, whatever is being discussed as part of the large narrative tends to eclipse almost everything else.
Yes, particularly when business, retail, advertising gets involved, which focused on New Christmas and gift giving. Aside from the religious aspect, I mean, there's religious aspects for both dates, and that's, I think, something that's important for people to realize.
It is, and of course, January 6th is Epiphany.
Yes, and so for those that follow Epiphany, this is not new.
No, and and the epiphanal celebrations tend to vary in scope, I think, and you can, folks can correct me if they feel like I'm wrong on this, but a lot of modern American Catholics, as opposed to they're modern Catholics in the United States, as opposed to Latin America or France, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, see Epiphany as an important day, but it's one of many days that kick off the new year and cycle through. And again, a lot of that primary focus is on Christmas, is on the Advent season, and Epiphany is seen as simply the conclusion in many cases of the Advent season. For example, Italy, Spain, Latin America, we have a lot of very specific epiphanal celebrations and lore associated with that as a standalone holiday.
That's true, and we hinted in when we started out that there are aspects of this that might be viewed as supernatural or witchcraft at other times of the year, and specifically, your discussion there made me think of Befana.
Yes, the Italian witch Befana, and she comes with her own special desserts, which you had me at Italian dessert. But let me just say that. But I'm very interested that the initial trail to Befana tends to stop cold at the overlap of the nativity, and I find that fascinating but a little frustrating for people who are not familiar with Befana. She's an Italian witch who on Epiphany Eve flies through the sky, and because of course that's what witches do. And
so does Santa.
Yes. So does that make Santa a witch?
There you go. Instead of an elf.
A shaman witch. The Elf King. Or is it the
No.
Witch King? The Santa is the Witch King of Angmar.
We're gonna get hate mail now.
For anybody who wonders, I love Tolkien. Okay. But Befana leaves treats for the children. She flies through the air. She does a lot of Santa-esque things.
Mm-hmm.
And the conflation of a witch into the nativity narrative, to me is very interesting. Maybe it's a little trite, maybe it's very sweet. I'll leave that up to everybody else to decide. But the basic gist is that the wise men, the three wise men, quote unquote, Reyes Magos, the three wise men are traveling, following the star to find baby Jesus. And along the way, they park their camels in front of an Italian witch's house. And
as one often does.
It's how I roll. And that apparently they stop in for some cake and candies and cookies because it is the Christmas season after all. So of course they're baking. And and they regale Befana with the story of what it is that they're doing. And she says, wow, I would like to come along with you. And they're like, that's nice. The camels leave promptly at 10. And I'm elaborating just a little bit. This is why my nieces and nephews like me to tell them stories. And then, because she is a very tidy Italian witch, she is busy sweeping up the house, and she misses her camel. And then is distraught over having missed the opportunity to visit baby Jesus with the three kings. Mm-hmm. And so in penitence, definitely a appropriate and responsive contrition for having overlooked the church, she now flies through the air on the eve of Epiphany and visits small children everywhere in celebration of the Christ child.
You know, I like it. And there's a bit of symmetry there with how St. Nicholas has evolved, because children leave him cookies and milk, and then she leaves them something at the end of the season. Yes,
I like it. I like it a lot, actually. And it's to me, it's very evocative. And in other Latin American countries and Spanish speaking countries, Reyes Magos are said to visit the small children and also leave them gifts in their shoes, not their stockings, their shoes. It is important, on the eve of January 5th. So the kids set out their shoes for candy.
So don't put your shoes up, put your feet in your shoes without looking.
Yes, it's very, very true. Come to think of it, I actually still have my stocking up, my Christmas stocking. I just realized that. My Christmas season actually runs from whenever I'm going, oh my gosh, I have to get the tree up, until Imbolc, Celtic Festival of Light. So, which is Groundhog's Day, in case anybody wonders. But there is that. Fingers crossed. There is some old lore that if you leave the greenery up, particularly in the church, but in general, leave your greenery up past Epiphany, that the goblins are going to haunt you.
Yes. And I think that is really where sort of the tradition has come for so many people, to immediately take their trees down after Christmas. They just don't realize that's the reason.
Right. I apparently am tempting the fates and the haunted goblins, because my tree is still up.
What's a goblin or two? I mean,
I actually thought it sounded kind of fun. So fingers crossed it works.
Just keep things a little more lively that way.
It does keep things hopping. There was we'll discuss a number of these points, but in Pyrotechnics and Praying Cows, Christmas in the Upland South, which was a December 17th, 1998 article published in the University of Arkansas educational website, there were a number of things that I found really interesting. I love the fact it was a easily accessible but pretty scholarly piece. And
well done.
I love this quote. The South was settled by Englishmen of Celtic origin. They came from the northern regions of Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and Cornwall, arriving at mid-Atlantic ports and then moving inland across America to the Ouachita and the Ozark Mountains.
And that's very accurate.
It is, and so many times in Christmas, and Old Christmas is one of those key points, that you start digging into the lore, it leads back to this. It leads back to these moments. It leads back to these people. And it's very difficult to understand the process. It's very difficult to understand and contextualize the lore if you don't understand that reality to begin with.
That's true. And there's specific reasons that they were attracted here. Because it was very similar to where they came from. Geographically.
That again, being drawn to the mountains, being drawn to the hills and hollers. And
by virtue of that fact, they remained more insular and retained customs longer, which ironically in those same regions in the old country, they retained these customs much longer as well.
Correct.
So something about the geography itself almost seems to lend itself.
I think it does. And there's certainly the pragmatic analyses, the understanding that these highly rugged areas resist outside change because it's hard to get roads in. It's hard to get railroads in. It's hard to build bridges in. Consequently, things move more slowly. Information goes more slowly. But on a certain level, I think that's more than that.
I think the people who tend to stay in these areas tend to be more resilient, stubborn.
Yes.
To have done so, and so they become less dependent on outside forces.
Right.
Not only just a self-reliance, but just for an interior sense of self and identity.
Yes.
Not needing
I would agree with
validation,
that.
I guess.
The not needing, and that I think is a really interesting point. Now we talk a lot about consumerism. I think that I would strongly theorize that individuals with a very strong sense of self-identity make poor consumers.
Very true. Very true. Kind of harder to sell the bill of goods to.
and so you see a lot of moving parts with that, because these particular mountain regions are attract individuals with a strong sense of self. The survival within the mountains themselves further that. They add fuel to the fire. If you can survive and prosper and perpetuate within these spaces, that gives you that much more reason to have that own internalized sense of self that then is also fueled by the lineage. This is my family. This is my clan. These are my people. These are our traditions. And building that really strong sense of resistance. almost to the point, and sometimes even to the point of creating pockets of culture that would seem, or do seem, certainly have seemed in the past, alien to quote unquote modernity, or this, people who have much of a, are much more narrative driven, larger narrative driven, people who are deliberately or unconsciously not resisting the larger mass messaging.
Well, I think a good example of that is, and I've heard it so many times in different facets of my career, that everything starts on the coast and comes inward, all trends, and that's part of it. And it's not, I think some people view that simply as the coast sort of get the new messages faster, but that's not really it, and hasn't been for a long time. I think part of it is that as you get away from the coast, you tend to get more of that insular identity, that is sort of a take it a moment to reflect, and I'll see whether it works out before I accept it attitude.
Right. And that's of course, like almost anything, there's pros and cons to both. There's positives and negatives associated throughout all of it, but this clearly has contributed to the culture. And of course, it's led to the fact that Old Christmas in some areas, certainly well into the 20th century, was still being celebrated in ways that could seem foreign to the outsiders. One issue, or one area that I wanted to get your opinion on: pyrotechnics. This was something that is still pretty common throughout the Ozarks, which is more as transition more to Christmas and New Year's, but especially Christmas. This is very new to me, growing up a Yankee in Central Illinois. Shooting off fireworks for Christmas, and then shooting off fireworks for Old Christmas, and shooting up guns, gunpowder. I'm sure at some point there was some dynamite involved, and and that's another thing. Early in the 20th century, dynamite was not terribly difficult to obtain.
That's true, particularly for farmers, because they often used it to, get rid of tree stumps, etc. And then, of course, in a lot of these areas, there was a lot of mining, so you had explosives around. Ironically, as you say that, my son Cameron was saying the other day, that it was telling a story and mentioned the fact that very early on, his uncles had taught he and his brothers how to make bombs with explosives. So, it's just part and parcel, I guess.
I think it is. And I grew up with stories of my grandpa, going to the hardware store to get dynamite for various things on occasion, again, for like moving tree stumps and occasionally playing ridiculous pranks. But somewhere in my growing up years, it dawned on me, I'm going, here's a product that I really only know from Looney Tunes. And yet Grandpa was able to get it for real. That was an interesting thing. This again, coming back to this.
Yeah, and I grew up with, okay, you can do whatever, just don't do it around the house or the barn,
Those are very fair rules. They really, really are. Going back to this first article, Christmas in the Upland South. Old Christmas was characterized by traditions that we would associate more with the 4th of July: bonfires, gunplay, firework explosions. And I love this one of these concluding quotes: people in the South love explosions. It's part of their celebratory customs. Do you think that this goes back to the Civil War, or do you think it precedes?
I think it precedes. I mean, I think it goes back to the old country. I mean, Guy Fawkes, for instance.
That's a good point. That is a very good point.
you know, you know, a little attempted revolution by attempting to blow up Parliament.
Right. And then consequently, the celebration of having caught and executed him is done with bonfires, it's done with fireworks, it's done with explosions. So, and burning Guy Fawkes in effigy.
Well, and I think that I've read that there were even a few sort of very similar kinds of celebrations, in Appalachia, in the Ozarks, for Old Christmas, of bonfires and perhaps some effigies and so forth. Not necessarily, I haven't found a lot of details as to exactly who the effigies were supposed to be, but they could probably be just whoever,
right,
at a particular time that someone was not happy with.
Which is not a bad thing to do. It's New Year. What do you think that, obviously we're dealing, these are celebrations that are heavily associated with the South and the upland South. It is oftentimes overlooked that the Ozarks are the furthest mountain range. The Ozarks and the Ouachitas are the furthest west mountain range and plateau, respectively. I do know my geology on that. The furthest west of the Old South. So there is a surprising, and I would say this, I think that most folks in Arkansas are very familiar with these layers of culture. I think that many people, particularly in more urban areas of the Missouri Ozarks, and certainly as you start moving northwards, Springfield, Jefferson City, etc., that there is less of an understanding, less of just that innate understanding that this is part of the upland South.
I think that's true. It becomes more of an unconscious thing. And I think, at least in my area, I think some of these celebrations end up getting associated a little more with just the idea of old time frontier antics. But it really came out of that. It's part and parcel the same in a lot of instances,
Yeah. And it, again, I'm fascinated. I find the idea that the desire to blow stuff up being a part of our cultural past, particularly in association with the South, possibly in association with our Celts, our Celtic ancestors, to be really fascinating and honestly pretty alluring.
Oh, I do too. I really do. But there is definitely something about explosions and gunfire and celebrations that is almost innate. And this time of year just as much as 4th of July. I mean,
right. And so much of that celebratory aspect has just been encapsulated in Independence Day.
Yeah.
For modernity. And that's it's interesting. Now, jumping subjects a little bit, praying cows.
I do find this fascinating, and if you can look at it from a lot of perspectives. One, of course, is just a religious perspective of honoring Christ and the season, but then you can't ignore the fact that we are talking about something innately supernatural and out of the ordinary.
Yes, yes, I agree. That's and uniquely magical. That
Yes.
and so there's okay. So there's a lot of moving parts to this that have large, to me, I think, larger appeal, but also speak to me on a unique and personal level. Real quickly, a lot of what we know in regards to Old Christmas, it was actually recorded by Vance Randolph.
Yes. Yeah. Or in Ozarks, yes.
Ozark Magic and Folklore, book published originally in 1947 by the University of Columbia, and then it's available for republishing by Dover Catalog. And a lot of bits and pieces of Vance's work, or the beginnings of Vance's work for further research, is actually available on Ozark Healing Traditions, which is published by Brandon Weston, who's also a published author with books on this type of subject. And he's down in Northwest Arkansas. Highly recommend that you check him out and check out the website. But there's a lot of very unique animal lore associated with Old Christmas. The most dominant or most obvious one happens to be cattle. And in short, the idea is that at midnight on Old Christmas Eve, the cows in the barn or elsewhere will kneel in prayer, in honoring the birth of the Christ child.
And it is fascinating. I think it's focused around cattle is interesting because cattle throughout history have tended to be very important to feed a family, to clothe a family, and get them through hard times in winter in particular.
It does. And there's a couple of points. Certainly, if we want to tie back to the Celts, cattle were sacred.
Yes.
The unique elements of cattle in lore, in Celtic lore, are dominant. Reference the cattle raid at Cooley being a notable one, but there are a number. And something else that is notable about Celtic lore is the introduction of talking animals, or animals acting human.
That's true. You get that in Germanic folklore as well, but very dominant in Celtic.
It's something that obviously this isn't unique to Celtic tradition, but something that I believe is notable to Celtic tradition is that animals were seen as vessels of divination.
Yes.
That and in some cases, obviously, by studying their entrails, we'll get to that in just a moment. But in various ideas, the idea that the animal has something important to impart, information, hidden information that is imparted on special days. I do love the fact that there's a number of bits of Celtic lore that are associated with talking salmon. And
yes.
It makes me want to go find some salmon and see if they have something that they'd like to say. But this is definitely associated, just in terms of this ideas. Could some of these bits and pieces of Old Christmas lore have come from things other than the Celts? Yes, it certainly could. But we've established 2 points of connection that I think are worth looking into. The first point is that so much of the upland South was settled by Celtic peoples. And second, the idea of talking animals, animals acting as a vessel of divination, animals foreseeing the future, animals communicating important things to mortals. at crucial
Mhm.
points and at crucial days, important festival eves, this type of thing is part of Celtic lore.
Very, very true. And sometimes there's a connection with the cattle or livestock in their talking or praying, and water or wells. And of course, water is seen as sacred as well.
Yes, that it's almost at the level of genetic memory.
Mm-hmm.
And go ahead.
No, I was going to say I was just agreeing
that so much of this lore was undoubtedly, if it got passed down, it was passed down orally. It was not passed down necessarily by written tradition. And many of the Celtic peoples, not all certainly, but many of the Celtic peoples who left, particularly early on, left the British Isles early on, were not necessarily even literate at that point.
That's true. It very much was an oral
society. Mm-hmm. And as I've said many times, with the understanding of the ancient Celtic civilizations, it is crucially important that people understand that when I say illiterate, I do not mean uneducated or not sophisticated.
Correct. Just not a written basis.
They did not necessarily have a written language, but that does not mean that they were dumb by any stretch of the imagination.
One bit of lore that I find fascinating, and again seems a bit magical in a bit, is that having 2 day breaks on Old Christmas.
Yes, stay up or get up early, and reportedly see 2 day breaks happening on Christmas morn. What does that denote to you?
Symbolic of renewal, new beginnings, perhaps. A day that maybe all things are possible. There's a lot of lore associated with luck, and so maybe seeing 2 day breaks is kind of like a rainbow. It's lucky.
It's one of the things I realize that it's not the same lore, but to me it's not dissimilar in context to the green flash that's reported to be seen at sunset.
True. I hadn't thought about that.
A maritime tradition, which I think is really fascinating. I'm still appreciative of the fact that they put the green sunset flash in at the end of, I think, the second or third Pirates of the Caribbean film.
Yeah, one of them they did. I can't remember which one.
Made it vastly more dramatic than it is in real life.
Hey, it is a movie.
I know, and I do appreciate that. Something that really, to me, is very interesting and very resonating, and also a little sad, I think, for me, is that, to me, there's a tie-in with all of this, particularly with our agrarian peoples, our very traditionalist minded peoples, who I think oftentimes see themselves as a bulwark against modernity or against the secularization of society, see themselves as standing in the way of just secularization, that is this desire to say, look, this date is holy, this date is special, something of crucial importance, something of supernatural importance, something of magical importance occurred on this date, and these magical things are going to happen that are going to prove that a bland, gray, flat, secular modernity doesn't have it right.
And I think that sentiment is why a lot of the lore also is associated with things happening that bring good luck.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, if you pay attention to those things, you're more likely to be lucky in the new year.
Yeah.
Or
Yes.
if you're born, boys born on Christmas, we're supposed to be very lucky in raising cattle, things like that.
Even going so far as being able to talk to the cows.
Yes.
And
I want to be a cow whisperer.
I know. And so depending on how you want to look at this, and I think, as is so often the case, the magical or the mundane depends so heavily upon one's viewpoint.
Yes.
And so let's take that and conceptually run with it for a moment. Boys born on Old Christmas can talk to cows.
Okay.
And from a mundane, secular perspective, you go, that's ridiculous. First of all, you can't talk to cows. Second of all, the date doesn't mean anything.
Right.
So this is just an example of a primitive society, a backward society, a hillbilly society, an animist society. Pick whatever you want, but the implication is that these silly, backwards, rural, isolated, primitive people really need to pull their head out of the you know what and get with the times. And
boy,
then,
how unfun.
Well, first of all, yes, it is utterly no fun whatsoever to live in a world devoid of magic. But then you could go and you could do your studies and so on and so forth that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that we can't talk to cows. I'm still waiting. I'm actually surprised that hasn't been a study. But
maybe it has somewhere. I don't know.
Yeah, I have not done the Google search, come to think of it. Oh my. Now, at the same time, let's say that a boy born on Old Christmas Day, grows up with these traditions that you can talk to cows. Let's say he has an affinity, even a preternatural affinity, for understanding animals. Mm-hmm. And this is encouraged. Now, first of all, many people may have this kind of understanding, but if it isn't framed within a contextual structure to say this has meaning, this is something that you could pursue, this is a way of understanding the world. So much of magic is a way of understanding the world around us, not quote unquote making something magical happen. On command. So little of actual magic is on command. And so it's, again, hypothetical, but this boy grows up within the structure. He has a preternatural ability to read animals, read their body language, understand their languages. That is not a verbal language, quote unquote, as we would think of it, or a linguistic language. And the fact is that he grows up and is able to talk to the cows, just not in the way that we would have read it.
Right.
I still think it's magical.
Whatever you call it, whatever you name it, or however you present it, it is. Yes. Mm-hmm.
There's this great quote, and this was from Vance Randolph. There are old men in the Ozarks today, and this would have been 1947. There are old men in the Ozarks today who swear they've actually seen cattle kneel down and bellow on Old Christmas Eve. But skepticism sometimes prevails, even in the Ozarks. I'll just drop it there. But that, just that, the fact that something magical could happen, I think, is a really, really neat way. I think it's a very positive way of looking at the world around us.
I do too. And even for the most skeptical, in the end, what's the harm?
Right. What is the harm? Why is if you choose to be highly skeptical or highly secular in your approach on this, is your life diminished any if I choose to believe that the animals kneel on Christmas, on old Christmas?
No.
I don't think so. There's also lore of roosters crowing. It's very toward the end of the notes, but I just had a personal story because I found is interesting, and I think it was either Christmas or New Year's. My sisters went out to the barn one time at midnight to see if the animals did anything, and the rooster started crowing.
Oh, wow.
At midnight, and they found that rather unsettling and came back to the house.
Fair. Now, and part of the lore, though, too, is, it made me think about it when you said they went out to see if they were kneeling, is that that if they were observed by a person, they would stop. That
Yes, and that you needed to be pretty sneaky at catching them in the act. That, and I did find that an interesting idea. The idea that, and this is of course it is today. I'm reminded of this every time I go to the grocery store meat counter and buy more protein. That animals, I rely on animals for food, and that is simply part of being an omnivore with incisors. That whether we like that reality or not, but that even more so in older times, for everyday people, the connection between animals as livestock, animals as food, being very close. There was not 16 degrees of separation. You didn't go and just find the nice cuts of meat laid out waiting for you. You had to do it yourself. It was extremely visceral. It was extremely immediate.
yes.
And something that
the story my mother would tell. When she was a child, she was about 7, and it was the first time her mother sent her out to kill a chicken.
Yes.
And so she has the hatchet and the chicken, and she starts to chop its head, and she kind of hesitates as she swings and doesn't do the deed entirely, but as she says, unfortunately sliced the poor thing's eye off. Which it's then running around the yard, and then her mother has to come out and finish the deed. And that stuck with her for the rest of her life.
Well, and understandably so. Is these aspects of life and death for the perpetuation of life are real.
Yes.
And they're real. They're difficult. They're not things that people like to think about, and even more so, I think we're becoming even more squeamish about it. As we're going, rather than less so, which I think is interesting. That it brings up well, I think we'll go. I want to go directly into hoodoo and entrails next, but I wanted to finish my point, which is that there's something very sad and heartwarming at the same time with the animals praying, because we're taking it, traditional farmers, people who are accustomed to butchering their own livestock, accustomed to all of these things, accustomed to this process. These are not individuals who have misguided sentimentality about animals,
right,
who on this one night are suddenly attributing anthropomorphism, personality, character, emotion, truly human qualities to animals, as they, are observing or saying that they observed them essentially going to church. That's really what is being implied here.
Well, and a very transcendent characteristic as well, not just human behavior, but something that goes beyond of belief in what you cannot see.
Yeah.
And so that's even one step further. And so that's not something that these farmers would jump to.
No, or take lightly.
No.
And which really brings, up and of course, as we're told many times, in regards to the date, January 6th or December 25th, that the Christmas celebration, old Christmas or new Christmas celebrations, being associated with the birth of Christ, and the idea that this is the official actual day, somehow signifying that that's the reason that it has these magical powers associated with it. Obviously, we know that we don't know what day Christ was born, and that these dates were chosen for a variety of reasons. But I think that it's really, really powerful that these dates become associated with this lore and just the gravitas and the magic, and that means something.
It does, but a lot of that, I think, kind of leading into the next subject, is the energy that we put into those days.
Yes. Yeah. And that there are rhythms, there are cycles, and there are processes, and which brings up and this, it's a quote that shows up in a number of places. It is in Vance Randolph's 1947 book. In some sections of Arkansas, there are people who bury the entrails of a black hen under the hearth on Old Christmas. This is said to protect the house from against destruction by lightning or fire. And I know that there are some families did bury chicken guts under their hearths as recently as 1935, not far from the enlightened metropolis of Hot Springs. And I did leave a word out because it could be considered offensive, but it might come to some people's surprise if you look up the quote. It does not denote, it actually denotes poor white settlers or white mountain folks. Yes. And so we have essentially poor whites practicing hoodoo on Christmas, old Christmas.
Yes. Which, basically this is, hoodoo for protection for the house, a hearth being the center of the house, and fire in particular, but also lightning, was a very common problem and the most likely way you were going to lose your house, particularly at that time period. So
right.
And this kind of offering typically is related to hoodoo and voodoo. The flip side is the reading of entrails for divination. So either protection or divination comes out of these kinds of practices. And it's also something that you're using something that normally you would use as food.
Yes. So obviously the black hen, the color of the hen, I would assume is crucial.
I have also read, that they would use a black hen if they could, but not necessarily. Any chicken and sometimes other fowl if they didn't have a chicken available. But I think a black hen was preferred.
Right. Now, an important note on this is that this was in an era in which chickens were getting butchered on a weekly or daily basis in the barnyard. So
having entrails around was not
right.
unusual.
It is today in most cases. You don't that's not part of our everyday lives, because this is general rule. But I think to a certain degree, it is the idea of using everyday things for protection in ways that are essentially for magical protection.
Yes.
Coming back to hoodoo, and it's important to note that hoodoo is, while it shares certainly some similarities, it is separate from voodoo. Voodoo is a recognized religion, and involves invocation to specific demigods or subdeities who overlap over traditional Catholic saints. And the voodoo loa have many different types of ways of approaching them for specific entreaties, needs, or just interaction. Hoodoo is much more pragmatic. It involves a lot of specific practices that are from, certainly at the time, readily available materials. Now, today, readily available, some of these traditionalist readily available materials are not as readily available.
True.
Or
at least for a lot of people.
Right. And chicken guts being one of them.
Right.
And at the or they're made up of materials that, while they might be readily available, modern folks might be resistant to the idea of getting down and dirty with them.
True. Although this particular kind of practice would be something that you could find both as a hoodoo practice, as well as being used in voodoo as well. I mean, there's overlap. So this is a kind of activity that you would see in either practice.
And I think that in something that seems to be indicative of hoodoo is a lot of the practices are very similar to voodoo, but simply coming from a almost pure pragmatism standpoint, as opposed to coming at it from a religious standpoint.
Right. Pragmatism and just a more of a, I guess, a naturalist point of view.
Which brings up or begs the question, and I don't have the answer to this: how do chicken guts keep your house from getting struck by lightning?
I'm not really sure. I've looked into this and I haven't really found a really good answer, other than the idea that giving something that is a real sacrifice conveys a protective energy. And of course, the hearth would be where you would cook the chicken. And so by placing part of the chicken under the hearth, it becomes protection.
Yes.
And I think that's the best answer I have at this point.
And I think that's fair. And it doing the research for this actually got me thinking about a subject. There was I think it was in Florida, but do not quote me on that, case in which voodoo practitioners were doing traditionalist sacrifice, but they were doing it in suburbia, and folks got upset, and
not on the cul-de-sac.
and I think it ended up resulting in things going to court, and ultimately the case being made that because voodoo is a legitimate recognized religion, and animal sacrifice is a part of an integral part of the religion, that it is part of their freedom of religious expression to practice. And if you don't like it, well, too bad. It's not their fault that this isn't part of your culture. And it's very
doing
easy
it on your front yard, then it's not your business.
Yes. But I remember, because I've grown up at sort of 1 foot in one world and 1 foot in the other, and it's very easy for me to be like, animal sacrifice, yikes. But I really remember that the striking argument that was also made just in conjunction with this, which was, you modern people that are upset about this have no problem letting someone else kill all of your animals for you.
It's true. I guess you're okay if you don't see it. Then, of course, there's a segment of that population that, are abhorrent to the idea of animals being killed and consumed. So,
yes. And I do think that the Haitian voodoo argument that says, that what we're doing, these animals' lives mean something. They are part of this larger process, and that unlike your possibly mass-produced slaughtering houses, that this is a lot more personal and humane and part of reality, and that that there isn't anything necessarily wrong with that. And I found that very insightful.
I do too. I think there's a lot of validity to that.
Not that I'm planning on. Actually, I don't even have a hearth. Isn't that sad? I have a stove.
You don't. That's right.
I know. I have no hearth.
That's the thing. You don't.
I have no hearth, and I have no chicken intro, so I'm poop out of luck tonight.
Well, there you go. I've got the hearth, but I don't have any intros handy. So. You find somebody you can bring them over.
If you've made it this far in the podcast, folks, we're proud of you.
Oh boy. Let's see.
Oh, go ahead.
No. I said I had a thought, and then I lost it when we went down that rabbit hole. Sorry.
I found it very interesting, the incorporation of elder, of elder shoots. That elder is considered, and for people who are going elder, elder trees, elder berries, elder brush, and the fact that and the lore is that on Old Christmas, the elderberries will sprout even in the frost, or perhaps even especially in the frost. And some of the lore also includes roses, this image of roses in the snow, new greenery, new growth, shooting up in the midst of a snowstorm, at midnight in the midst of the frost, at a very magical occurrence of something that couldn't possibly happen, having it happen.
And my grandmother would speak of that, of various flowers blooming during frost or even snow in January, and that meaning that it was supposed to be a good year.
Yes, that, and again, the idea of a magical event denoting good luck and acting as divination.
And I grew up always being, hearing that an elderberry tree, was particularly good luck to have near your home.
Yes. Yes. And now I do think it is interesting. Of course, the particularly elderberry fruit, the berries, have a long history of medicinal use.
That's true.
And the elder, and there's various cultivars. The elder holds very important significance in terms of magical tradition.
And then evergreens in particular, that early in the Ozarks, they would have a service on Old Christmas, and often in a shelter made out of evergreens. Was not unusual. Right.
And we've talked a lot about, the evergreen symbolism is important throughout Northern European lore, winter lore, across the board, and in various aspects, and including me tempting fate with the possibility of getting my home haunted by goblins by leaving my tree up. But
that's just a hell of something interesting going on.
I do my best. There was just a couple of points. This is letter to the editor, Christmas, from the Wayne County Journal Banner.com. Of course, and coming off the elderberries, old timers would say that the elderberry sprouts on Christmas Eve, even if the ground's frozen and the green shoots could be seen under the snow. And this was during a time when so many more people were associated with rural America. They farmed, there were association with farming, etc. And so people were out working in these conditions every day, often for long periods of the day. They were involved. And so consequently, if something was odd, if something stood out, it stood out for good reason.
Yes. And something out of that ordinary, I think it often was associated with some of either an omen or luck.
Yes. And it usually one of the two. Omen, and both sort of under the umbrella of divination.
Yes. And very much so. I think when you think about it, a lot of this type of lore fundamentally is divination that we don't tend to think about when we talk about it or recall it, but that's really what it is.
Yes. And in some cases, it's, that sense of, I'm going to see the future. Something that I would posit, and I don't know if I'm correct on this or not, but I would posit, is that, especially when this was much more of a, inner, built within the fabric of society, the younger, I'll say practitioner, but I mean it just as people who are engaging in the lore, younger, being very results and opportunity focused. Yeah. The idea I'm going to see I'm coming back to the dumb supper. I'm going to do all of these things, and I'm going to, see my husband, my future fiance.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. That's why we bob for apples, although we've forgotten that's why we bob for apples, and that sort of thing. But as the practitioner matures, something that I think seems to happen in many cases is is simply the idea that happenings around us mean something and everything is somehow interconnected.
Yeah. That there's a pattern, there's a link that gives larger meaning.
Yes, that the idea that the universe is not as random as we think that it is, which also is a largely, certainly during the 20th century, somewhat less so now. I'm waving at you, string theory, but a 20 later 19th, well throughout 20th century secularism is basically everything's random, nothing's connected.
Right, and until they start figuring out that's not the case.
Yes, and
entanglement, etc.
The idea that all these things may actually be quite connected, and in ways that you can possibly imagine. And not unlike Star Wars, the Force, everything. The Force is in everything. Everything is the Force. That sort of thing. I need to go back and watch Empire Strikes Back, but I have not watched Empire Strikes Back because I haven't had any donuts.
Okay.
Speaking of everything being connected, one of my most memorable childhood experiences was getting Empire Strikes Back on VHS the same weekend that my mom made fried donuts. And
so the two are connected.
For me, yes, in the large universe. And so if I'm watching,
I was wondering what I was missing.
I know. It's rather specific, but so consequently, when I watch Empire Strikes Back, I really think that I need fried glazed donuts, and
fair.
That's not really legitimately on my menu at the moment. Consequently, I have not watched Empire Strikes Back because I just don't know if my psyche could handle it. But fortunately, I have memorized the 3 films.
We'll have to make you a tofu donut.
Bean curd. It's all about the bean curd.
That's right.
Yes. But yes, the larger purpose, and I think depending upon where one, and you could actually argue Jungian shadow on this in terms of practitioner, because I think that there's, in terms of this traditional rural and very much magical practices of earlier America, which are heavy in the Ozarks in terms of our traditions, that this divination of seeing an interconnectedness, depending upon one's perspective, it can certainly just at the early onset of it just give you this magical sense that the world is a magical place, which can imbue you with a certain amount of optimism. You can try to harness that for luck, for the I would say, and I don't necessarily mean this negatively, but the selfish purposes of trying to divine one's future. As I think that you age, you can kind of transition to one dominant side or the other, seeing death omens everywhere you go, or trying to avoid death omens, or simply seeing this larger, more nuanced magical purpose that there is meaning, and you might find it simply within the larger nature. You might find it within and as we're talking about tonight with this Christmas lore, finding it within a religious context that I honestly think is very beautiful. It's very kind, and and I think worthy of a lot of respect, regardless of what someone's religious views are.
I agree. And that said, maybe a good place to pivot to ghost stories.
Absolutely. Much like Yule, much like winter solstice, Old Christmas and Old Christmas Eve was considered to be a time when the dead walked, talked, and at times interacted rather fervently.
And I think a lot of people would be really surprised that there are so many, times during the darker part of the year that happens. And through sort of the holiday season, people think of Christmas Ghost and the Christmas Carol by Dickens as the ghost story. But Old Christmas was supposed to be a time that ghosts could actually walk the earth. I mean, we are really similar to All Saints Day.
Yes, which is, I think, is a really fascinating aspect. I think that it's, I'm still processing exactly how I feel about this, because as we've noted many times in terms of paranormal research and doing investigations, that paranormal activity can happen pretty much anytime.
Oh yeah.
And for a very wide variety of causal reasons. And so much activity can happen throughout the day, throughout the evening. There isn't, specific times in which the dark magic happens and then other times that it doesn't. Paranormal activity is surprisingly normal and surprisingly common and surprisingly all the time. But I do think that there is important significance to the idea that specific dates and times are associated with this type of occurrence.
Well, and particularly ones with omens or some sort of luck. Again, the two subjects seem to be coming up. Of course, Christmas Carol is about omens.
Yes.
And particular ghost story out of Illinois, actually on the edge of the Ozarks, has to do with luck and retribution.
It does.
Karma, basically.
And another name, I believe, for Epiphany is 12th night.
Yes.
And so 12th night overlaps Epiphany, overlaps Old Christmas. And this is from, make sure that I get all this, From Christmas to 12th Night in Southern Illinois by John J. Dunphy. And John J. Dunphy has a great bookstore in Alton, Illinois.
Yes. We have shopped.
Yes. So huge shout out to John Dunphy in Alton, Illinois. Visit his bookshop. Say hello to his various cats and houseplants that are growing in the window. The cats are not growing in the window. The houseplants are.
I'm not sure that it's just plants, but John is delightful.
Yes, and loved getting to visit with him, and phenomenal. We have books.
Yes, we both did. Yeah.
Yes, because that is how that goes. Do you want to tell this story? This ghost story that he collected?
I guess I could. It originally was written by Roy Helton. That before sunup on Old Christmas morning, and that a young woman named Lomi Carter stops by a cabin of the man who killed her husband. Tolby Barton, the murderer, isn't home, but Sally Ann, his wife, is, and invites her in to rest for a while. When asked where she has been so early, Lomi replies that she visited the graveyard near the Salt Lick Meadows where Barton had killed her man. There she had seen her husband's ghost. The specter's head was still bleeding where Barton's bullet had passed completely through it. Lomi tells Sally Ann that the ghost kissed her and said that Jesus had forgiven Barton for the murder. He then whispered something to Lomi. She doesn't tell Sally Ann what it is before vanishing. When Sally Ann again remarks that Toby isn't home, Lomi reveals that she shot him to death with her late husband's rifle. Sally Ann says that she heard 2 shots, and the second gunshot, Lomi explains, came from the rifle of Toby, who managed to kill her before he died. Sally Ann had been talking to the ghost on old Christmas morning. Now, there's a lot of symmetry going on.
Yes, there is.
I find it interesting that there's a lot of unspoken things going on too, that Sally Ann apparently knows something's going on because she heard the shots but doesn't bother to say anything. Which makes me wonder whether she already knows.
That's a good point.
And of course, then you also want to know why her husband, why is he there with a gun early in the morning at the place that he had already killed someone? Except for perhaps that he expected trouble. Maybe he expected the ghost, because it was old Christmas, who did appear, although I'm not sure if he thought that a gun would help. But then Lomi showed up and
they went at it.
But of course, if you're talking about luck and retribution, it's not even again, because now 3 people are gone.
Yes, they are.
So if I were Sally Ann, I would not go to the Salt Lick the next old Christmas morning.
No. And that is, you tend to see it. I feel like you see with elements of these stories, one of 2 extremes: either tempting fate by just walking straight into it, being drawn like a moth to a flame, or I'm gonna have absolutely nothing to do with any of this. I'm leaving.
Yeah. Well, in this case, both walked straight into it with guns in hand. So
yes, they did. It's I think it's an incredible story, and it does something that a lot of our more civilized aspects would never touch about Christmas, which is not just ghosts, murder, retribution, ghosts killing people. There's a lot of things going on here, and at the same time, the way it's told, it is almost just simply told as poetic prose. Yes.
And I think, again, one thing is that everyone involved had to have some sort of hidden knowledge for all of the events to happen, including Sally Ann, the one survivor.
Yes. Which implies, by its very nature of hidden knowledge, implies the employment of the occult.
Yes. Very much so. Now that we have ghosts on Old Christmas, just winter tales themselves.
Yes.
And I think Fair Charlotte, or in some versions Frozen Charlotte, is I always love this story, and of course it's been done as a folk ballad many times. One thing I really like about it that's unique is it is something that was started in North America. It is not a folk story or ballad that came over and morphed.
Right. A uniquely North American. And you can really read that into the subtext of the things that are going on. This is a something that's clearly associated with the North American winter, but also North American culture.
Yeah.
That and there's, so for people who are not familiar, the basic synopsis is that Fair Charlotte, super short, non-poetic version of Fair Charlotte, is that it is in the depths of winter, not the kind of time when you'd want to be transiting about in fashionable but lightweight clothing. And there is a big party, a dance, a ball that she wants to attend. Her mother typically entreats her that she needs to bundle up, as almost is all but universal amongst teenagers. They're going, I don't want to look warm, I want to look good, or
Yes.
I at least want to look trendy or want to look like my peers. And Charlotte is not only very young and beautiful, she is also very fashion conscious and insists that she is going to be just fine. And her driver, and it's typically associated, this is a horse-drawn sleigh.
Yeah.
Or a type of sleigh, and off they go into the frigid darkness. And he keeps saying, "Are you okay?" She keeps saying, "Just keep on," because she doesn't want to be late to the dance. By the way, she chose not to be bundled up in a big coat or anything that would spoil her fancy outfit. And they finally pull up to the party. Her fiance or betrothed or boyfriend or whomever he is comes out to see his beautiful girl, and she's frozen to death.
Yes. And it I don't know, it's very, it's a haunting tale, not trying to use a pun, but it really is. And I do wonder if there was a grain of truth somewhere that something similar happened that started the legend and the folk song. But
it easily could have been. It is important as a native North American ballad. It is native to North America, not just the United States. So this is a Canadian and United States historical ballad. It's been found in Newfoundland. It's been found in South Dakota, and it's also been found and recorded here in the Ozarks.
That was, I think, the first time it was recorded in this part of the country was, I think, the 1920s.
That sounds about right. The Max Hunter collection in Missouri State does have the song on record being sung in 1963 in Fayetteville, Arkansas by Lula Davis. And folks can go to the Max Hunter collection and actually listen to that song. It's quite good. The excerpt is quite good.
Well, and a more even more modern version is Frozen Charlotte.
Yes, by Natalie Merchant.
Yes. And this was so prevalent that it actually created a trend of porcelain dolls, and they tended to be called penny dolls or Charlottes or frozen Charlies, but and I've seen them before. I don't actually have one, but they're just little dolls that typically would be baked into miniature cakes. And
Which is bringing us right back to Epiphany and Saturnalia.
exactly. And the idea was, I've heard various lore, but if you got the cake with the doll in it, then it was some sort of good fortune. And often for preteen girls and early teen girls, it was an omen that you were going to meet your future husband.
So it's divination.
Yes, it goes back to divination. And they were very popular from the mid 1800s into the 1920s and 30s. And every once in a while, I've seen them in antique stores and so forth. And I don't know, there is sort of just a chilling effect about them that they dolls don't usually bother me, but it's something about the frozen Charlottes have always just kind of creeped me out.
I think that's very, very fair. It is odd, and of course, one association with the story is certainly dating back to around the Civil War. Another name for the Fair Charlotte story was a corpse went to a ball.
Yes. And I think maybe that is a bit of catharsis, basically cathartic art dealing with just the mass death and casualties during the war. Although ironically, it's the young girl that dies instead of a young soldier.
It is, but it does speak just to the mortality rate of the era of these previous eras.
That's true.
And the idea that we've all heard the saying, you can catch your death of the cold.
Literally she did.
And literally she did. But and possibly this is why it resonates, much like Anne of Green Gables reenacting the Lady of Shalott. The idea that it's very poetic, it's very beautiful. You don't die bedridden from pneumonia. You died stately in a sleigh, demanding that you got your own way, and you arrive frozen but beautiful.
Yes, I mean, that's almost, as they say, be careful what you ask for, you may get it. I mean, that's just like what she asked for.
Very much so. It really has obviously there's a number of horror elements. Richard Young and Judy Dockery Young recorded Frozen Charlotte in their Ozark Ghost Stories book. And that was actually my first introduction to the story, not as a song, but as an oral story for traditional storytelling of the Ozarks. So it does have a great deal of ancestral gravitas in here in the hills. And at the same time, it was very interesting because a couple of years after I read the story resonated. It is a chilling and memorable story. And again, it's a little bit of that tragedy on a liminal space, that not dissimilar from the Burning Bride of Fayetteville.
Right.
A beautiful girl at a point in which it really should be a very happy or festive moment, turning into this exquisite tragedy.
Exactly. And that might be a good way to segue into the tales of the lost child.
Yes,
because
which
where Charlotte is this exquisite beauty and perfection, so to speak, the lost child motif in the Ozarks is just the opposite.
very true.
It's basically based on the Raggedy Man, in the traditional English sense, and the sort of the story that first told it so well was written about 40 years ago, and it's titled "The Lost Boy of the Ozarks." And I think I left my note in the other room with the author. I'd have to find it again, but
It is. You can look it up. Yeah,
yeah,
it's available on backpacker.com,
yeah.
or Google search The Lost Boy of the Ozarks. It is a really fascinating. It is fiction,
It is.
But it is a unique bit of fiction that it's clear that the author has ties to Southwest Missouri.
Very much so, and this is a compliment to the writing. It is written in such a way that it can very easily be taken as factual.
Yes.
And the idea of basically a child that ends up lost in the woods and remains and is not necessarily human anymore.
Right. That you're making that transition. Now, I do want to, and I don't have notes on this, but just engage a little bit with this, the English Raggedy Man lore. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, and that's when we get over to the movie The Lost Child, and they specifically refer to the Tatterdemalion. A
Yes.
Tatterdemalion in English lore, before it got connotation of being some sort of spirit or demon, literally meant a raggedy man. And a raggedy man would be someone that was in the wild, in the woods, usually, ragged clothing. A good sort of use of the term as analogy that people might be familiar with would be the Mad Max movie Thunderdome, when Tina Turner refers to Mel Gibson as Raggedy Man. That Mad Max in that movie fits that motif.
Yes. Yes.
And
so
yeah.
I was going to say it to some degree, then it might have some connotation with the wild man or the green man.
Yes, I do think so. If you go back far enough, that's my guess. And then over time, the idea of a tatterdemalion became a spirit or demon in the forest.
Right.
That was a trickster that would appear childlike to draw you in, very similar to a lot of the different lore and creatures that we've talked about in the Dark Ozarks, that luring people to their demise.
Yes, and this is something that there's a unique crossover from fiction into fact, back into fiction, back into fact, because an increasing number of actual reports in regards of inhuman entities luring people or stalking people do come in, and these and by do come in, I mean the reports do come in. I'm not telling the inhuman entity that they can come in,
Right.
because I'm going to say no in that particular regard. But that there's just a lot of oddness that I think lends, it does a variety of things. One thing, it lends credence to some of these reports that I think in previous times would have been dismissed as somebody just being crazy or wanting attention.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. And, you know, a number of these have, you know, have come to us directly, in contexts that have credibility with the narrative, that's at least something is going on. But kind of flipping back over to The Lost Boy of the Ozarks, the idea is that this child followed a little sister into the woods because, you know, looking for her. She disappears, and he, you know, basically lingers and years later is found and has not aged. And what is he, you know? And then, and it's a very well done story. Then, in about 2018, a movie which not only was set in the Ozarks, but was filmed in the Ozarks, actually in the West Plains area, The Lost Child.
Yes.
Basically retells this type of story, particularly with the Tatterdemalion. And we've seen it at an event that we did. And I find it very interesting, not only for the idea of this spirit or creature, which the idea is it's looking for a replacement for its parent, basically, in the movie.
Yes, which is uniquely chilling.
It is. It is. But another aspect I find very interesting is that there's a lot of depiction of hoodoo as practice.
True. And I'm assuming that is very deliberate.
Yes, it is deliberate and I think pretty faithful. But the idea basically being that there can be things out there that particularly seem to make themselves known in these dark times, cold times, almost like the winter brings them through more too.
Right. There's the as you noted, the film Lost Child was released in 2018, and the very simple synopsis of the film is that, quote, Fern, an Army veteran, returns home in order to look for her brother, only to discover an abandoned boy lurking in the woods behind her childhood home. After taking in the boy, she searches for clues to his identity and discovers local folklore about a malevolent, life-draining spirit that comes in the form of a child, the Tatterdemalion. Yes. And there are a number of key hoodoo elements, as you noted, that are included in the film. Something that is interesting about this particular read of the Tatterdemalion, and this is also a read on The Lost Boy of the Ozarks, is a near vampiric quality.
Yes. If not literally, definitely energy and life force that it. And I like the supposition that it does not have to be a physical attack.
Right. And the concern, and we're not giving any spoilers away, highly recommend that you watch the film. It's very well rated on Rotten Tomatoes, and for good reason.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
I did too, immensely. It's just beautifully filmed. I love when films in the Ozarks are actually filmed in the Ozarks.
Same. With a lot of local actors as well.
Yes, and that adds a level of just of an impossible to fake reality. I mean, it just it adds contextualization you can't get otherwise.
It's more authentic.
It is, but the idea that the Tatterdemalion and there's a number, and if I think this is interesting, a number of folkloric entities associated with this, that they drain you of your life in ways that you don't understand.
Yes. And then the protagonist at the same time is coming, basically stepping, she's been away for a number of years. She's coming back in and being exposed to this witchcraft and hoodoo practices that she initially fears and thinks as a threat, when in reality, most of it's being done actually trying to protect her.
Yes.
And those around her.
Yes, which I think is it's very well crafted. The themes, the ideas, the conflict is very well crafted, and something that was interesting to me, and I think this is valuable just across the board, because we explore our own reality through the categorization of fiction. I think a lot of people who love fiction don't necessarily realize that. And that a lot of people who might say, oh, I only read nonfiction, may not realize there's an enormous amount of truth in the world around us explored correctly within fiction.
Very true. Very true. And a little bit of symmetry with this too, from where we almost started, is that a lot of what she ends up taking in from the people around her to protect herself and home and hearth, the practices very similar to the idea of the entrails under the hearth.
Yes. Yes, it is.
Particularly against fire.
Right. So there is that symmetry that exists, and I thought there's a really good analysis of the film on ghosts of anti-fascism past.org. I was trying to read all of the uncapitalized consonants and not being successful on that. Ghosts of anti-fascism past.org, entitled Tatterdemalion, the antidote to the horror of Stephen King. Take with that what you want, but there's a great categorization of your three standard types of horror: folk horror, supernatural horror, and psychological horror. Folk horror, often set in rural or deindustrialized landscapes with poor whites as protagonists. Supernatural horror, the threats our characters face, and therefore the source of the fear and terror they express and we vicariously feel, is of supernatural origin, i.e. The Exorcist. Or psychological horror, here the reliability of the narrator and or protagonist is questioned. Frequently their sanity is suspect. For example, Donnie Darko. And with a great deal of ambiguity. And so that and horror realism as well, and the idea that Tatterdemalion actually exists at a 4-point crossroads of all of these categories.
It really does, which makes it very interesting and thought-provoking. I think if people go watch it, they'll be thinking about it for quite a while afterwards.
Yes, and it's honestly, it's a fun film.
It is.
And for people who are like, oh my gosh, I don't like horror movies, it's not a slasher film.
No. Not a horror film in that sense.
No, it's not Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's not Friday the 13th. It's not Nightmare on Elm Street. But
if you enjoy the things we talk about here, you're going to enjoy the film.
very much so. Very much so. I loved it. I want to see it again. I'm thinking about buying it.
Me
But
too. Me too. That might be a good place to kind of wrap up. Coming full circle. So there is a lot of connection between Old Christmas and the supernatural, the paranormal, horror.
yes.
And
And
the
some of
Ozarks.
it is so many of these folkloric stories and folkloric stories associated with Christmas and the Ozarks honestly do have a folk horror element, which I think is very phenomenal. It's easy to overlook with the way that the stories are presented, but if you were to film them, the elements would be there.
I agree. So we appreciate everyone, and don't forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
On the next episode, we are going to be discussing the Ozark connections to the dark history of Texas and more. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and other podcast platforms. We thank everyone, and remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.